Hi, my name is John Niehaus. I'm Director of Program Development for the National Association of Flight Instructors. I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the NAFI Briefing Room, the online video series where we find interesting topics and we find experts to talk about them. So today, my guest is Art Hyson. Now, Art is the owner and founder of Hyson Aviation, specifically Mountain Flying Adventures. He is a Bronze Legacy Master, which means that he has earned 5 NAFI Master accreditations. He's a CFII, MEI, ATP. He was also is also the most active safety counselor and fast team lead rep for the Northern California area. And in 2020, he was the regional fast team rep and regional flight instructor for the San Francisco region. And so today our topic is mountain flying. Art, welcome.
Thank you, John.
So that's quite the lengthy bio. You've been doing quite a bit, both as a fast team rep and as an instructor. Out of the things that are on there, I'm sure there's a lot more. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I think if I go way back, I'm from East Central Wisconsin, Sheboygan County, and that's not quite the flatlands because we have the Kettle Moraine. And as a kid, I was fascinated with the woods and the hills and the outback, but it wasn't really until I came to California in the late 1960s and early 1970s that I discovered the magic of the mountains that we have here in the West, and that's the Sierra Nevada and the Cascade Range, and I've flown all over the country to Alaska and northern Canada, pursuing my fascination with mountains. That I just love mountain landscapes, and we'll get into a little bit more detail later about my getting into teaching mountain flying. But it's been a passion for years since I was a child in the 1960s or even 1950s in East Central Wisconsin.
Yeah, so I mean, you traded in the lowlands for the highlands, and I imagine that flight instruction is just a lot different when you start to change those landscapes, and the concepts are the same, but the things that you're looking for and the things that might be dangerous are going to be significantly different, right?
That's correct. If you take a look at the Aeronautical Information Manual on the designation of mountainous terrain in the U.S., the western 1/3 of the country is designated mountainous terrain, with the exception of the Central Valley of California. And I live in Sonoma County, which is a isolated valley north of San Francisco, and we do fly in the mountains when we do cross countries, but it's not really true mountain flying. So we train in the flatlands, and we're dealing with meeting those aviation completion standards now, the old PTS. So we deal so much with training pilots on all levels to meet those standards. One thing goes missing. And that's the details that you really need to know to fly safe in mountainous terrain. And it's not just high elevations with the density altitudes that we have in the Tahoe area, say today of nearly 9,000 feet, but in all different types of terrains and landscapes in the West.
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting thing, the definition of mountain flying. What would you say to somebody who says, you know what, I just earned my private pilot certificate. I'm from Michigan. I'm going to fly out to Colorado, and it's fine. I could do this. I don't need to get a flight instructor for this. Like, what's your visceral response to something like that?
Well, I would have to cite my own history. And that dates back to the late 1970s when I achieved my private pilot license. And my brother-in-law from Connecticut came out, and it's always hard to talk family members into sharing expenses, or friends sharing expenses when you go flying, but I talked him into going to Lake Tahoe. I had absolutely no training or background in mountain flying. And I'd learned how to fly in a Cessna 150 and 152 later on. And we rented a Cessna 172 XP. And some of you might remember that or know what it is. And it's 195 horsepower. To me, it was a rocket machine. So away we go, John from Connecticut and myself to Tahoe. Warm summer day like today. We went into South Lake Tahoe to the High Sierra for lunch on top of one of the casinos. Not a gambler, but a good lunch on top with a view. And we headed back middle of the afternoon. They had a control tower at the time. I fueled up because I thought, well, that's what all good pilots do. You can't have enough fuel. So fueled up. And I think those controllers were putting down money on whether we were going to reappear after we disappeared behind a ridge south of the Lake Tahoe airport. And, you know, we had the sense to spiral up, get out over the lake, over the cold water, and get some altitude and fly safely home. You know, that was one of a couple of wake-up calls. And, you know, I would say to those people from the flatlands that it'd be a good idea to do a mountain flying course, to do training. Whether or not you physically do it is one thing, but at least get some background training in the challenges of mountain flying and all of the considerations. And there's so many between, you know, the PAVE acronym, you know, the pilot, you at altitude, the aircraft, the environment, external pressures that may be on you to fly through those passes to get home when you should be on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So get some training.
So what does a professional mountain flying course look like? Is it several days? Is it a day? Like, what goes into that?
It varies depending upon who's doing the program. Here in Santa Rosa, I do an all-day class, a ground school, and then I take people up on what I call flyouts, where we get a group of pilots, and I tailor it to the pilots that are graduating from the program or who are returning to do the flyouts. And to me, a flyout is to fly out to a mountain destination. In the case of last May 21st flyout, I took the pilots from the Sonoma County area. Sometimes we leave from regional airports and we meet up en route. We're air to air. I took the pilots up through Yosemite, up the Grand Canyon of the Tuolumne River, over Tioga Pass, which the pass is at 10,000 feet, into Nevada and the east side of the Sierra Nevada, and then flying up desert terrain, landing in Tahoe. And we usually stop for lunch, get everybody gathered around, you know, assess the last leg of the trip. And, you know, it gets to be a learning experience, but also an adventure.
That sounds absolutely beautiful. Really pretty, I imagine.
It is, you know, and that is the draw that, you know, brings me back. As many times as I've done some of these flights, like the May 21st flight that we went over Tioga Pass with a group of 7 airplanes. I was in the lead, radioing back the conditions to the other aircraft. As many times as I've done it, it's just a unique experience every time because conditions are never the same. Mm-hmm. And the group of pilots is never the same.
So I know you tailor these to individuals, and certainly I would imagine the airplane itself plays a little bit of part in this. But when you do one-on-one training through the mountains, like what are the specific types of things you're looking to cover? You know, is there a unique maneuver that you do, or like what does that kind of thing look like?
Well, it can vary, and also depending on the airplane. And what I focused more on was stabilized approaches and analyzing the terrain and how to approach, say, mountain airstrips that are on plateaus or down in deep valleys, all varying conditions. So it's taking a look at the strategy for flying into places. You really need to look at the performance of the airplane and definitely density altitude issues, which in the mountains of California can be a major challenge. Lake Tahoe area, which is world renowned, and it really is the gem of the Sierra, has a couple of airports that are at 6,000 feet above sea level, and temperatures that can reach 90 degrees Fahrenheit on a summer afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
So I train the pilots to, regardless of the power and the performance of their airplane, at Truckee Tahoe Airport, which is near Reno, I say use almost 8,000 feet of the runway. Even though you may have what you think is that rocket machine, do a short field takeoff technique and climb out from the airport. And there can be density altitudes of over 9,000 feet at places like that. And even airplanes that perform really well at sea level just don't do that well.
Yeah, I've flown over the mountains, but I haven't really flown sort of through them or really anywhere near close to them. But I do remember from my training days, when you read about mountain flying in books and stuff like that, the biggest thing that they always mention is the winds, right? They always talk about, this side of the mountain, that side of the mountain. Is that something that you cover really heavily as well?
In extreme detail. And one of the sections in my workshop for the pilots is mountain meteorology. And one of the main topics there is how the air curves around, the rocky outcroppings. You can envision a river of air like a river of water over rocks in a stream, and how it creates turbulence and eddies and whirlpools and all of that. Now, I had a scheduled mountain flyout last weekend where I was taking another group to one of the other Tahoe airports, and I canceled it because despite the fact we had wonderfully blue skies and smoke free, which is really a bonus these days out here in the West, the winds over the ridge tops were over 30 knots. And that's kind of a rule of thumb for me, that if the winds are over 30 knots over the ridge tops, I would think about postponing. And we had winds gusting to 24 knots at both Truckee and Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe Airport.
So when you say winds over the ridge tops, and what makes that so dangerous?
It's because if you can envision, what would be a good analogy? Well, you have this air coming off of the Pacific Ocean, and it's passing over San Francisco and over the Sacramento Valley. And as it comes up the mountains on the west side, you're going from sea level in Sacramento to 10, 12,000 feet over 100 miles. But then on the backside, it drops off. In some cases in the Southern Sierra, it drops from 14,000 to 4,000 feet, 10,000 feet in only a couple of miles. So you could imagine that laminar flow of air up over the windward side of the mountain. What's happening on the backside? What happens when you stall that wing? The air is starting to burble down the backside, and you may remember the adventurer Steve Fawcett, around the world adventure in different kinds of aircraft. And he met his maker or demise just south of Yosemite. in a mountain wave with winds like we're talking about now, where he was flying a super decathlon, which is a high performance small plane. Yet, even if he could climb at, say, 1,200 feet a minute at the high density altitude that he was at, the air is spilling down at maybe 1,500 feet a minute. So he may have been at VX trying to outclimb the terrain, but he's going down at 500 feet a minute and couldn't make that turn in the tight canyon that he finally crashed into just north of Mammoth, California, and southeast of Yosemite.
Never had a chance.
No, and that's it. And it's a matter of physics. You can calculate that. And that's one of the things that I do in the mountain flying class is I have a chart showing the slope angle of the mountains, the speed of the wind, and what the downdraft will be. You can calculate it. And on that particular flight, the downdraft was probably over 1,000 feet a minute at a high density altitude location.
Now, in addition to all of this, do you either require or provide the training yourself in terms of, the high altitude, like oxygen type training or survival training? Does that come with mountain courses, or is that something you do separately?
I do an advanced mountain flying class dealing with survival techniques. In the basic class, we touch upon survival techniques and packing emergency gear in an emergency bag. And I have it tailored to the particular environment that we're flying in. And, the survival courses, can be extremely detailed. We just go over the basics in the basic program, but I do advanced programs on that.
To bring this back to instruction, I've done a lot of interviews over the last couple of years, and I've loved each and every one of them that I've done. And I always try to pull things away. And one of the things that I really like, or commonalities that I've noticed, is that a successful instructor, or some of the most successful instructors, are the ones that specialize. And of course, that's what you're doing here. You're specializing in mountain flying and sort of teaching the trials and tribulations of what that actually means. How did you get into it? Did you have somebody who showed you the ropes, or was it mostly trial and error? Like, where does that start?
Well, that's hard to really pinpoint the exact date, but early on, I started getting involved with helping out with the aviation safety program, the FAA safety program through the Oakland FSDO. And that was as early as 1978. So I was exposed to many of the safety programs, and some of the safety programs were on mountain flying, and combined with my love of the mountains, and I've backpacked into the mountains and all over the world, and not a climber, but a trekker. So I got fascinated with tips on mountain flying from the safety program brochures. They look really comical when you look at some of those brochures today, but that's what got me hooked. And working with the safety program in 1990, I volunteered because I also am a college university level meteorology teacher to teach a session for the Civil Air Patrol's annual mountain flying clinic in a very mountainous part of Northern California. So I got involved doing the CAP program. And then not too many years later, I started doing mountain flying classes on a small scale. I started touring the San Francisco Bay Area, San Jose, South San Francisco, Oakland, East Bay, and I travel around. And this was in the old days where I'd had my overhead projector, and all the transparencies.
Oh yeah.
And we'd sometimes get, 100+ people, at these programs. But, doing the on the road show, as you'll, find out from probably a lot of the people you've interviewed, is really tough. And, I don't do the touring anymore, but I do the programs online and starting to do them in person again. And it keeps me up and current. And one of the things I have to say, as for instructors, is if you go to the wings programs, you meet a lot of pilots.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be a thankless thing at first, but you start circulating with the pilots, and you get to know all of these people. So you may be stuck flying a Cessna 172 or an Archer. Not that that's a bad thing, but you might run into a guy, that has that, latest Mooney, or like a really nice Bonanza, or the Velocity, or the RV7 fella that, I'm doing an extended IPC with. All of those people I've met through doing classes, volunteering. I do talks to the EAA, Chapter 124 over here, and talk to them about flying to Alaska, flying to British Columbia, and it's fascinating to them. And then they get with me and say, well, maybe you can show me some of those techniques. And I say, well, let's hop in your airplane and let's go up to 10,000 feet over the airport and see how it works. So it's, getting involved in there, a lot of volunteer work, not getting paid for it, but indirectly, in the end, you're getting paid for flying in really fun airplanes, as well as doing something you might enjoy. The same thing could be said for an aerobatic instructor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing you say is, if I wanted to become a mountain flying instructor, someone who specializes in that, wants to, maybe create a business doing something similar to what you're doing, what you're recommending is, certainly you've got to go out there and do it, but you got to make sure that you know what you're doing. So take the courses yourself first, of course. But then a lot of it becomes sort of networking and sort of picking people's brains and sort of understanding, what works and what doesn't work from people that have been out there and have done it, and then create sort of a
brand
a lesson
name
plan or a syllabus brand name of how you intend to do that. Is that sort of summing things up a little bit?
That's an excellent synopsis of what I've done and what works.
Now, Art, as we wind this down, for somebody who's looking to get into doing, what you're doing, or even on a smaller scale, just maybe they are moving out west and they want to continue to flight instruct, what would be your best piece of advice for somebody who's sort of dipping their toe into this environment?
Well, I would talk to the locals, and always try to get as much information in the new region that you're flying in, or if you're flying out to a mountain destination, gather as much information as possible. Try to talk to somebody who's been there before. When you are moving to a particular area, just bring up the subject with instructors, with pilots. Work yourself, into, the local knowledge, the little tricks of the trade that, just don't come out of a textbook. That would be, my recommendation. And then, you can, build, clients, or if you have students and they've graduated and they've achieved different certificates, say, for your own safety and for actually for having a lot more fun flying safely, let's go up to Telluride or, wherever, you might be in Colorado, or Lost Creek in Montana, or the Bob Marshall Wilderness area, some of those areas. And try to get information from people that have been there before, and play it safe, and build up your own experience.
I think that's great advice.
Yeah.
Art, any final thoughts?
Well, I would say, what is one of the last slides I have on my workshop is, it's a scene from the Prince William Sound in southern Alaska, looking up at Mount McKinley, or in Denali National Park, which has a mountain of 23,020 feet high, snow crest ridge, and we're 100 miles away, and it's a perfectly clear day. And the title I have on the bottom of it is "Go for It." Yeah, but go for it safely.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. So finally, does Mountain Flying Adventures have a website? Where can people go to get more information?
It's www.mountainflyingtraining, one word, mountainflyingtraining.com.
Well, Art, it sounds like you have had some amazing adventures. And when people talk about, well, why be a pilot, more specifically, why be an instructor? The adventures that you have had through the course of your career, I can only dream of in some cases, I think. And that's huge. It's being a flight instructor is not always just trips around the pattern. It is what you make of it. And it sounds to me like you've made a pretty amazing experience out of it. And so with that, folks, I want to thank Art for joining us here in the NAFI briefing room today. And in his words, go for it.
All right. Thank you, John.